Crossroads in northeastern Oklahoma are the site of one of the worst crimes imaginable. On June 12th of 1977, 2 busloads of Girl Scouts left Tulsa headed for Camp Scott, a Girl Scout retreat located on the Cherokee Reservation some 50 miles away. Among the girls were 10-year-old Denise Milner, 9-year-old Michelle Gouset, and 8-year-old Lori Farmer. What happened next is unthinkable. 3 young girls, beaten, sexually assaulted, murdered.
There are children's names you always remember. Lori and Denise and Michelle. They're there. And they're never going to go away.
All of our innocence was lost that day. I can guarantee you there's not one counselor who wouldn't have given their life if we knew what was going on.
The murders set the stage for a frenzied manhunt.
And they got several hundred volunteers looking for him.
And a bewildering legal battle.
You can't change your fingerprints or shrink your feet.
45 years later, there are still no answers in Oklahoma's most notorious crime.
It was my prayer that things justice would be served.
But now, an unlikely series of events has pried open the past, revealing secrets that could break this case wide open, unearthing the truth behind the Girl Scout murders.
My name is Stacy Sean Perkins, and I'm from Locust Grove, Oklahoma. What was the atmosphere like in 1977? Well, I was 14 years old, so here's all I knew about the atmosphere. Boys, my girlfriends, swimming at all the various locations around Locust Grove, because there was all kinds of places to get into the water. Basketball and cheerleading. And so that was my life. I mean, those were the things that I knew. And the song that was really popular at the time was Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper, which is a song about love and death. And that was the song that just rolled over and over my head into the summer of 77. And it was a song of riding around in the night, in the darkness, in a small town, in rural areas where there was no light, and having to build a campfire, telling stories to one another. It's in 1977. All of the places that teenagers went to had to do with water. And there were no hangouts around here. There was really nothing to do other than get in your car, your truck, and go to a water place. You go to Big Hollow, you go to Humpback, Rock Crusher, Twin Bridges, Devil's Cut. You know, you go to the creek or you go to the lake and hung out at night, you know, smoked some things probably and drank a few things you weren't supposed to. The water attracts us. It attracts us all. It's the reason Camp Scott existed where it did. People were proud of Camp Scott. My mother was the editor of the local newspaper for years, the Mays County Chronicle. And 1976, the year before this happened, they did a big 2-page spread celebrating the camp and its origins. My feelings about what happened to these 3 girls, they go deep. And there's a feeling of shame and guilt because this is my town. And I love this town, and I love growing up here. And then at the same time, you had the horrific thing happen here in Locust Grove. There was an atmosphere in this town, which I don't think is unique to this town, but there was an atmosphere of just a lack of protection of girls. There were teenagers who were known to drive around the camp and hoop and holler and shout and try to scare the girls at night. There was a back road that anybody could have driven in. Harold Berry, who was a trooper here, would go over to the camp whenever it was in session and just scatter the boys, keep the hooligans away.
Wow.
Oh gosh, we can get bricks from the park.
Seems much bigger.
Wow. And the library set over there on those two walls.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an indoor and an outdoor to the kitchen.
Right.
Yes. And then the latrine and then the pool. I think we can jump up here and go to Inspiration Point. Go to Inspiration Point.
I'm Carla Wilhite, and I was a counselor here at Camp Scott in 1977. We would ride down here on the buses. It was kind of like an experience because you're leaving the city behind and you're winding down these country roads into Locust Grove. And you come through that gate and start down that road, and it's literally like driving into a cathedral, because the trees are just arching over and you're in this tunnel of light and green. Coming to Camp Scott was like coming home. It was something that you waited all year. You couldn't wait. You would pack your trunk and you make sure you had your creek hiking shoes and that you had your flashlight, that you had everything on the list. You brought stationery so that you could write letters to home and, tell your parents that you were doing great. But the biggest thing was just being with other Girl Scouts and learning how to be a part of Camp Scott.
Those are great. That's my brownie pen. My royal pen.
You
The
got it.
backside is 77 Camp Scott.
Yeah.
Big deal.
It was a big deal. It was just like it is today. I mean, exactly like it was. The sounds, smells. It's just a beautiful place to be.
My name is Barbara Day, and I was the director of Camp Scott in June 1977. The whole camp was woodsy, about 410 acres in total, so it was vast. There was one road in and one paved road out.
Hi, my name is Michelle Hoffman. I was the support person to the camp director at Camp Scott in 1977. I was 15. One of my jobs was to assign the girls to the appropriate unit based upon their age. So for the first week, I knew all the girls that were coming. I knew their names.
Among the campers is a precocious 8-year-old named Lori Farmer, a natural leader protective of her 4 younger siblings. 1977 is her first year as a Girl Scout. There's also Michelle Goudet, a 3rd-year Scout. She has a passion for competitive sports, particularly soccer. She sat in her mother's lap the night before camp started and said that she would miss her while she was gone. And there's Denise Milner, one of only a few African-American girls attending Camp Scott this summer. Like her tent mates, Lori and Michelle, she is multi-talented, participating in gymnastics, tap dancing, and the church choir.
as I began to board the bus, I saw Denise and her mother. Denise was visibly crying and upset. So I walked over and introduced myself, said, "Hi, I'm Michelle. What's your name? Come on, we're going to go have a great time. You can ride with me." And we climbed on the bus, and she was sitting by the window, and I was telling her all the great things that we're going to do at camp. And her mother came on the bus, Betty, and she was like, I could tell she was worried about her, right? And she's so she can call me if she gets homesick. So I was like, I'll make sure she's taken care of. And we had very little conversation because she was nervous and she just kept looking out the window. But when we got to camp, we hit Cookie Trail. I was like, so this is Cookie Trail, and all your cookie money goes to help maintain this camp and this trail. When the bus stops, you end up at the staff house. You're going to find out what unit you're in. Qualify. That what? He was Comanche. And the youngest girls were in Cherokee. The tents are arranged typically in a somewhat circular U shape. The counselors sent by the trail that came into the camp. Tent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Lori, Denise, and Michelle were assigned to tent number 7.
Absolutely felt safe here. Never had any fear of anything. Yeah, it would be dark at night, but by the time that you've been here at Camp Scott for I don't know how many years, you could walk the trails without a flashlight at night.
This is a big facility, and there were 230 campers, 30 staff, and 10 counselors in training, and a ranger and his family. And my husband was still there that first night. Thank goodness.
My name is Richard Day. My wife was the director of Camp Scott. My wife had asked me to come up and help the ranger put up the tents because it had rained and stormed the day before. He was behind, and he wasn't going to be able to get all the tents up. I worked till probably 9 o'clock at night putting up tents with the ranger, and then I stayed with Barbara in the cabin instead of going back home.
But that night, it started raining.
Scattered showers and thunderstorms, occasionally heavy, producing local flash flooding in some areas, particularly in low-lying places and also in urban streets.
It was a big Oklahoma thunderstorm. It was raining hard and loud.
So we were up at Great Hall when the storm started. You were in northeast Oklahoma in a storm with all the different trees and the wind whipping through, lightning and thundering. My name is Amy Sullivan. I was a 10-year-old camper at Camp Scott in Locust Grove, Oklahoma in 1977. We sang on the singing porch for a really long time. I think they were just kind of hoping to wear us out and hope the rain would stop. But I think at some point it started to get dark and they just wanted us to get back to our tents.
And so we did singing porch out here underneath the cover and sang, and it kept raining and raining. Finally, when it started to slack off a little bit and it looked like it was going to stop raining, we were given the go-ahead to go back to our unit. As we hiked back down to the unit, the trees just continued to just drop rain on us. we were soaked and muddy. But once we were able to change our clothes, we went out and we tried to help each tent kind of get ready for the night.
Yeah, there was just a lot of screaming, laughing, girls giggling, and counselors yelling at us to be quiet. We went the back way out by tent 7 in the latrine, and I said, hang on a second, and I walked over to the front of the tent, and I was like, good night, girls. Hey, Denise, it's Michelle. Just want to say good night. I'll see you in the morning. They were laughing, and I interrupted them laughing, but and then we went on our way.
I went out and I walked the whole circle around all 7 tents, and at each tent, wherever they were, being loud, I told them it's time to quiet down. And I did go out later that night because I heard a noise. Didn't really sound like an animal, didn't really sound like a person. It just kept going on, and it was kind of over across the fence. And I went out with my flashlight and I started walking over that direction, kind of trying to shine my light and see what it is. When I would shine my light, the noise would stop. So I'm like, okay. Turn around, start walking away. The noise starts again. So I do this a few times, and I can just feel this apprehension growing in me because I don't want to tangle with whatever that is. I can't see what it is. I don't know what it is. I was thinking it could be somebody just trying to scare me, and haha, you did. So it's time to come out and laugh at me, but that didn't happen. I went back to my tent, and it eventually stopped, or I fell asleep. I don't know which. But I can't describe it. But like I said, I can hear it.
I guarantee you, if she knew what that noise was, if it was associated with what was happening, she would have given her life in a second.
My intended routine that morning was to get a hot shower because the showers in Kiowa were cold water. I knew that the hot water wouldn't last very long at the staff house. So I set my alarm for 6 because I thought that would be plenty early to get up. So I grabbed my dry towel and put my glasses on when the alarm went off. I started up the road. And I looked over to my right and I saw some sleeping bags in the road. And the first thing that I thought was, oh my gosh, some sleeping bags must have fallen off the truck when they delivered all the girls' luggage. I better get it. But then as I started walking closer, I could see a body. And then closer, could see it was a young girl. And recognized as I approached that this young girl, she was motionless, wasn't breathing. It was just an overwhelming recognition that this child is dead. I know it sounds completely crazy, but the only thing I could think that made sense is that one of the girls had become scared during the night and ran into a tree because they were just at the foot of a tree. I came right back to the tent. I woke Dee up. I woke Susan up, and I said, we've got to count our kids. There's a dead kid in the road. They were just like stunned, as I was. But I started at tent 1, and they ran to other tents, and we were actually going into the tents and feeling for a child in each cot. By about the time I got to tent 3, Susan came and told Dee and I, there's nobody in tent 7. So now we know we've got 3 kids missing. And I just started running up the road. I was breathless and trembling.
Richard and I were sound asleep, and it was barely light, and terrific banging and hollering. It's kabang, 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 kabang.
Startled me and Barbara, and so I got up and answered the door, and they said they had done a check, and that 3 of the girls were missing from a tent. They said they saw some sleeping bags beside the trail.
And Richard just bolted like a bullet.
So I was walking with the counselors up this trail. I picked up one sleeping bag, and you could tell there was a big lump in the bottom of it. And then I picked up the other, was the same kind of feeling. I did not look in the sleeping bag. It's always haunted me a little bit why I didn't. I felt like if one of them had been alive, maybe we could help them. But later on, we found out they were already dead. There's a kind of a quiet sense of what it was like that day. And it's a little unsettling to be here where the girls were found.
Everything felt really surreal. Like this isn't really happening. I'm not really awake. I just couldn't believe how something like that could happen. And boy, yeah, everything changed from that moment.
My name is Kent Freitas. I'm an Oklahoma City author and attorney, and I'm the author of Oklahoma's Most Notorious Cases. One of the girls was out of the sleeping bag, and the other 2 were zipped up in the bag. The one that was out of the bag had a blow to her head. The other 2 sleeping bags were zipped up, but when they were unzipped, they discovered the other 2 girls had also been beaten, and all 3 of them were dead. They had been restrained with duct tape in one way or another, and one of them had a piece of cord around her neck that had something on it that they later determined was a gag. Right away, of course, they called the authorities.
Harold Berry, a highway patrolman who lives nearby, is the first to arrive on the scene, followed by Mays County Sheriff Pete Weaver and agents from the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, known as the OSBI. The first responders observed that both Lori Farmer and Michelle Guzet had very likely been knocked out by blows to the head with blunt instruments, while Denise Milner appeared to have survived longer than the other 2 girls, because her body was still warm when the authorities arrived. All 3 girls were sexually assaulted and found about 150 yards away from tent 7.
Mays County Sheriff Pete Weaver would not speculate as to the exact times of the killings. Did anybody else hear anything, Pete?
No one. We can. We've canvassed the area. There's not been any commotion, nothing out of the ordinary.
As police descend on Camp Scott, the counselors do everything they can to hide the tragedy from the young campers.
Barbara Day comes driving out in the camp station wagon. She's driving fast, right? And she looks panicked and she stops and she goes, "Where are you going?" "Get up to the Great Hall." She'd never talked to me like that, ever.
I wanted all the girls off the campsite as fast as we could get them. And I invented the story that we lost our water supply. We had no more water, so we couldn't cook, we couldn't drink, we couldn't bathe.
We got dressed and proceeded up to the Great Hall, and we were walking along the road towards the Great Hall, and 3 ambulances and then 3 hearses drove by us and turned. And I did not think twice about that. It's kind of profound to me that it just didn't register as something was wrong. We went on a creek hike, and that's when I thought things were a little bit kind of strange. All the counselors were sitting kind of back near the woods. They were not down interacting with us. They were sitting there and they were kind of holding their knees. Counselors who'd been so nice and so fun the night before were just very reserved and stoic. We got back from the creek hike and the buses were there, which was really disorienting. And they're like, "Well, girls, you got to get on the bus. You got to go." All of our luggage was in this kind of pile, and there was like this circle drawn around it. So then we went back to Tulsa. I found my grandma. She was upset. We got my stuff, got in her car. And at one point, at a stop sign, or stoplight, I said, "Grandma, why did I have to come home? What happened?" And she's like, "Oh, honey," and she just started crying. And she goes, "3 girls were killed at your camp." And that was just incomprehensible to me that could have happened. When I learned what had happened to them, it was almost unbearable. To know that what they had to experience, and then to know it happened on our land and on our watch, and we weren't able to stop it. And I still clearly have a lot of emotion about that, because I could guarantee you there's not one counselor who wouldn't have given their life if we knew what was going on.
I started having dreams that same week where I would be lying on the ground at the foot of the tree, and there was a large person over me, and I recognized in my dream that I was being murdered.
Right after, and all through high school, I didn't really realize what was the impact. I started experiencing depression, and I couldn't tell you why, and I started having major anxiety attacks that were debilitating. And I really couldn't tell anyone because I thought I was losing my mind.
It had conquered me that you don't ever master that kind of fear
with that kind of experience.
At the crime scene, police begin collecting evidence, looking for possible clues. They find a red flashlight left by the bodies, its lens covered by plastic with a hole in it to make it harder to be seen at night, and multiple prints. A bloody boot print on the 10th floor, along with the print of a tennis shoe. But just as the investigation is getting underway, and before any evidence points to any particular suspect, the local sheriff states he knows exactly who committed the crime.
Immediately, Sheriff Pete Weaver identified Gene Leroy Hart, who was a Cherokee Indian, as the prime suspect. Hart was a felon who had escaped the county jail. He'd been loose in the woods around there for over 3 years, going on 4 years.
Gene Hart is a complicated character, a hometown hero well known in the community as a charming football star, but also a man who had committed a series of terrible crimes.
He had grown up about a mile or so from the camp, so that wasn't entirely illogical to make him a suspect, but really the entire investigation from that point forward focused on Hart. Hart had been convicted of raping 2 young women. He had tied them up, raped them, and left them in the woods in Mays County. He went to the penitentiary in McAllister for that. He served a little over 2 years, and he got out not too long thereafter. He was convicted of a series of burglaries, really, and this time they threw the book at him, so he was put back in McAllister.
In 1973, Gene Hart escaped from the county jail where he had been brought for a hearing.
He was gone about 10 or 11 days, and somebody convinced him to turn himself back in. He turned himself back in, but he didn't like jail, so he just escaped again.
Now, 4 years after those incidents, Hart is the only suspect in the Girl Scout murders, and law enforcement is on the hunt for him yet again.
Police expected it would be difficult to find the suspect here in these hills because he is a native here, an outdoorsman, and has successfully evaded the police for more than 4 years since he escaped from the county jail in 1973.
As the hours tick by with no sign of Hart, rumors spread throughout the community that he is receiving shelter from local Cherokee families.
We know that they have harbored him in the past, supplied him in the past.
But Mays County Sheriff Pete Weaver seems ill-prepared to handle a complex triple homicide.
Let's be real clear about Sheriff Pete Weaver. He was not a trained law enforcement person. He was probably unqualified to be a sheriff. He was likely unqualified to investigate any kind of a murder, much less a complicated murder. His background was that he ran cattle and owned a drive-in restaurant. He was a small-time politician, is what he really was.
It was a posse, more than 200 townspeople at Locust Grove at sunrise today.
There was a tremendous manhunt. They were shooting. They got several hundred volunteers, and they marched through the woods looking for him. That was totally futile. The woods over there are thick. They're hard to walk through. And besides that, you're talking about the summertime when there are mosquitoes. It's hot. There are chiggers. There's nothing worse than chiggers. The Oklahoma chigger is the most persistent animal in the world. It burrows into your skin and it itches for days at a time. They brought in dogs who were supposed to be these special dogs that could find anything, and all the dogs did was get worn out and get what amounted to heat stroke.
After a week of scouring the Locust Grove area, officials found their first solid lead near the camp.
Law enforcement announces that 2 squirrel hunters have come across a remote cave which appears to contain evidence that links to Jean Hart. In the coming days, authorities say 2 more caves with clues to the investigation are discovered, and inside them, law enforcement says, are photographs.
The photos were identified as photographs of women who lived in the area of the Granite Prison in southwest Oklahoma. A photographer at the prison had taken the photographs, and one of Hart's prison jobs had been to assist that photographer. So they were reaching the conclusion from that if those photographs were in the cave, that Hart would have retained them after he got out of prison and left them in the cave. If he had been in that cave and left these there, it would have tied him to the murder scene. And then in the third cave, somebody had scratched a note on the wall that said, the killer was here, and had a date.
On June 23rd, 10 days after the girls were found in their sleeping bags, and based on the evidence the police said was found in the caves, the authorities charged Jean Leroy Hart with first-degree murder in the deaths of Lori Farmer, Michelle Guzet, and Denise Milner. But many locals and others tracking the developments in the investigation are surprised, even skeptical.
Now, we've been told that so far all of the evidence you have gathered on Mr. Hart has placed him in the area and connected him with the photographs, but that you have not been able to place him at the scene of the crime. Is that correct?
Again, you're asking me to discuss evidentiary matters, and as a prosecutor, you can appreciate I can't get into the evidence. You'll have to accept my statement that I had sufficient evidence at the time the warrants were issued for the probable cause to charge this defendant with the crime.
My name is Faith Phillips. I'm a Cherokee, an author, a former attorney, and I live in Locust Grove, directly across from Camp Scott. Sheriff Pete Weaver, at the time, did say that he would shoot Jean Hart on sight if he had the opportunity, thus confirming rumors amongst the Cherokee people that Jean Hart wouldn't have a chance at a fair trial. We have a long history of Cherokees not receiving equal protection under the law.
I'm Ross Swimmer, former principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. We didn't have adequate housing. We didn't have water to most of the communities. We didn't have roads that were passable in many areas of eastern Oklahoma. We had very poor schools. A lot of times your county governments were non-Indian, and that created conflict sometimes with the Indian population. And anytime you get into a situation where you have a Cherokee like Hart and horrible crime has been committed and law enforcement has said this is the person that did it, you are going to have the other side, the non-Indian community. So, well, you know, that's what happens with Indian people around here. They just, you know, are uncontrolled. They do bad things.
My name is Condessa Teehee in English, Seal Woy in Cherokee, and I am a professor of American Indian Studies at Northeastern State University. There's always been a really strong suspicion of government in general from Cherokee traditionalists. And so when they start saying, you know, there's this full-blood Cherokee man who has all of these ties to traditionalist families and to traditionalist communities, it wasn't necessarily about his guilt or his innocence. It was, he's not going to get treated fairly.
The killer has not been caught. Authorities are still meeting after 2 weeks to try to find the best strategy to use.
Alarm was held here, we moved through here.
Now, in general, the sheriff and Sid Wise, who was then the DA, they were mostly just making excuses. that they couldn't find him because, again, it was sort of an insult to their authority. I mean, this guy, they hadn't been able to catch him for going on 4 years.
I think Sheriff Weaver was pretty humiliated by this because while Gene Hart was on the run, he was hiding in plain sight. The community tells stories of him showing up at football games, showing up at funerals. He was at public events, and the sheriff's office still couldn't catch him.
Oh, there were all kinds of rumors that he was heavily armed, that he had the help of Cherokee magic, and he was a shape shifter, and that he was being spirited away whenever they got near him and that sort of thing. But there were all kinds of stories because he was so hard to find and had been hard to find before. But some of the law enforcement was actually doing some smart things. I mean, they were trying to find people who were Cherokees that they could talk to who would help turn this guy in. There was an agent named Larry Bowles who apparently was a very good agent because while everybody else was out beating around in the woods, getting nowhere fast, he was trying to talk to the Cherokees and find someone who would finally talk to him and impress upon him that, you know, this was a horrible, serious crime and convince him that Hart would get a fair trial.
The manhunt stretches on for 10 months. And then there's a break.
It was just chaotic.
Everything surrounding the trial was controversial.
There was a lot of manufactured evidence, a lot of sloppiness in the whole procedure. There's not one person done it by themselves. We all 12 agreed on that.
Three girls, 8, 9, and 10, were beaten to death early today while spending the first night of a week-long stay at a Girl Scout camp in northeastern Oklahoma.
All of our innocence was lost that day.
Immediately, Sheriff Pete Weaver identified Gene Leroy Hart, who was a Cherokee Indian, as the prime suspect.
Two squirrel hunters came upon this cave. Eventually, there were 3 caves discovered, and each cave seemed to have something that linked back to the investigation.
It was just assumed he was guilty. And if people are assuming he's guilty, then the thought was they're not going to treat him fairly.
It was rumored Gene Hart had support from local Cherokee families.
He was somewhere around there, hiding, yet they couldn't find him.
murder of the 3 Girl Scouts shocked Oklahoma. Law enforcement officials thought they knew who did it, and for 10 months they searched the hills of northeastern Oklahoma looking for this man, Gene Leroy Hart, a 34-year-old Cherokee Indian who had escaped from the Oklahoma penitentiary 5 years ago.
My name is James R. Powell. I was an agent with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation for 17 years, worked primarily in the 70s and 80s. I worked with many of the agents that were at the crime scene, and I learned what I know about the original case from those agents. Gene Hart was a local. He only lived within a mile of the crime scene. He had been convicted of 2 previous rapes earlier on. He had escaped from the Mays County Jail several times. So there was some history there between Mays County Sheriff's Office with Gene Hart. The sheriff at the time, Pete Weaver, didn't particularly care for Gene Hart, and he was identified early by Pete Weaver as being a primary suspect.
Well, obviously, the only way anyone was going to be able to find Hart was to talk to Cherokees, because nobody's familiar with this land the way we are. So they were going to have to find someone who was willing to give him up.
In the spring of 1978, almost 10 months since the murders of Denise Milner, Michelle Guzet, and Lori Farmer, that's exactly what happens.
My name is Susan Cadeau. I've been a broadcast journalist in Oklahoma for 33 years. Larry Bowles was an Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agent who was part Cherokee. So that gave him access right away, where some who were not affiliated with drugs would not have that access. That's a major in right there that turned out to be a big help in this case.
Hart was staying with an old Cherokee named Sam Pigeon in a remote cabin in the Cookson Hills in eastern Oklahoma. That was about 50 miles south and a little east, I think, of where the crime took place. It was back in the woods, no road in there, no traffic. No people ordinarily would go there. And that's been a hideout for bandits for 100 years or more. I mean, you're going back to Pretty Boy Floyd. There's a place called Robbers Cave. It's the same sort of terrain. But that whole area over there, they have a reputation of being closed-mouthed and not cooperating with the law.
On April 7th, 1978, an army of agents from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation moves in and surrounds the shack.
Hart did not put up a fight.
I'm very happy to announce that at 4:15 p.m. today, agents of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation arrested Gene Leroy Hart at a rural residence in southern Adair County.
How do you feel at this moment now that it's been captured?
I don't know. I've tried not to think very much about Mr. Hart. I don't know whether he did it or he didn't do it, but I felt all along that he had to be gone, that perhaps he held the answers that we all need to know or want to know.
One of the things they did when they found him is they took kind of a celebratory picture where they surrounded him and they all wanted to get some credit for it. He was arrested, and you might be interested to know that they did not put him in the prior jail. They took him immediately to McAllister, to the state prison. He'd broken out of there twice. That was enough.
Hart is charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of the 3 scouts. The prosecutor, Sid Wise, declares he will seek the ultimate punishment available under the law, the death penalty. But Sid Wise is quickly consumed by controversy.
It was discovered that Sid Wise, who was the district attorney at the time, had made a book deal with a reporter or journalist named Grimsley, where there were accusations and some proof that Wise had given him what were believed to be confidential documents. And because of this controversy, Wise was removed as one of the prosecutors.
Replacing Wise is Buddy Fallis, the longtime district attorney of nearby Tulsa County. For the defense, two young lawyers, Garvin Isaacs and Gary Pitchlin, both Native American, are hired to represent Hart.
Isaacs had never tried a murder case before, had never defended someone accused of murder before. Your first murder case is something of this magnitude. The whole state is embroiled in it. 3 little girls, the nation knows about it. What a first experience for him in the courtroom with this bombshell of a case.
In June of 1978, the preliminary hearing gets underway. It's like a mini trial, where the judge decides if the case should go to trial. And it's here that campers and counselors share a frightening tale of events leading up to the murders.
Every spring, the council would host what's called the Cadet Camporee, and it was just for the certain age of Girl Scouts to get together from across the council to learn even more skills and activities and to have a chance at leadership and adventure.
And there was a girl with the Girl Scouts walking through the woods, and she panics and screams and calls the adults around. And there, hanging in the trees, is what is described as a particular assemblage of sticks. It's also referred to as an effigy. So it's hanging there in the trees, and the little girl said it looked like a man was hanging in the trees. The adults didn't think that it was anything of note. Apparently they didn't see what the girl saw in that assemblage of sticks.
Pre-camp, the only were counselors and myself. And someone found a cut, and I think it was in the body of the tent, and maybe at the back of the tent. A long cut, about 3 feet, big enough for anybody to crawl in or out of. There were also some other things missing. There was one of our axes or hatchets was missing from the unit kitchen, which was kind of the central meeting place in the unit. That night, for some reason, I decided to sleep in the staff house. I was the only one in there. It was dark. There's a vapor light out in the front, but in the back, it's just woods. I heard somebody walking behind the staff house. I was like, what the hell? And then somebody scratched on the window screen. I yelled, yeah, who's there? Because I was still thinking it could remotely be somebody just trying to scare me, and haha, you did. So it's time to come out and laugh at me, but that didn't happen.
The next day, we went up to the Great Hall for dinner, and afterwards we went back to our unit. We got into our tent. The tent was just in disarray. Just stuff everywhere. And clearly our things had been gone through, right? So we were like, what the heck? And I remembered that my mom had bought me a big box of Hostess donuts. And I saw the donut box sitting to the side of the trail. All the donuts were gone, but inside the box was a note. And it was, those little bitty memo pads that reporters often use. So it was like 4 or 5 pages of that had been ripped off. The paper was dirty, like it had been carried around. And on this front one, it was in really big letters. It was this funky K with loops. And on the front page, it said, kill, kill, kill. And then there's a bunch of scribble on the second or third pages, and occasionally we say God, and just scribble. And on the last page, it said, we're on a mission to kill 3 girls. And I showed it to my friends, and they're like, well, that's weird. I said, we should probably take this to Barbara.
I didn't know what to do with it. I just didn't. It could have been a prank from a camper. I just had no idea what that was.
After Barbara, the camp director, dismissed it as a teenage prank, the note was thrown away and never turned over to authorities.
If I had known a tent had been slashed the night before Lori was to get on the bus to go, I would have never let her go.
When you have a lot of teenagers involved with as counselors or getting trained on the staff, you're probably going to have some shenanigans going on. So when you see something like this, like the donuts being taken and the note being left and effigy being hung, and disturbing as those were, hindsight is 2020.
So I understand from the perspective of the parents that they see that there was some kind of negligence for not being informed. I also see the perspective of the director and the camp counselors, because it's 1977, you're in this beautiful place where they've only had wonderful experiences together, and there's absolutely no way to foresee that a murder like this could happen.
What we don't account for are the monsters. We don't expect them. Even today, we don't expect them.
At the preliminary hearing, the prosecution presents a number of pieces of evidence that they say connect Jean Hart to the murders, and which the judge admits into trial. Among them are items authorities said were found in the cave, where Hart supposedly hid out after the murders. The first of which are professional photographs of women.
The photographer that Jean Hart had worked with at Granite State Prison confirmed that he had developed those photos with Jean Hart when he was an assistant while he was working in jail.
Prosecutors also claim that sperm found on a pillowcase at the crime scene matched sperm found on Jean's underwear from prison, and that hairs found on the duct tape at the crime scene were tested and determined to be from a Native American. While all this is taking place inside the courtroom in Pryor, Oklahoma, outside, tensions are flaring.
You'd have to live there to understand the dynamics between the Cherokee Nation and local law enforcement at the time. It kind of split the community into 2 sides. Jean Hart was a local. A lot of citizens of the Cherokee Nation, as well as some of the folks in Cherokee County and Mays County, thought Hart did not do it.
It seems patently obvious that Hart was a violent individual based on the crimes that he committed previously. But if you're a Cherokee living here, there's an established history of the state acting sometimes as judge, jury, and executioner. Sometimes the state lied, sometimes the state framed people, and sometimes the state manufactured evidence. So it really wasn't that much of a stretch for Cherokees to believe that perhaps the state had framed Jean Hart.
I understand that people get framed, right? But if I thought a Cherokee man had committed those murders, I'd go after him. I wouldn't give him grace because he was Cherokee. I didn't know this until I was like in my 30s, that my family had gotten calls from our family members who were Cherokee and said, if Michelle testifies against Hart, we'll remove you from the family. Right? It's like, that's so crazy.
Michelle Hoffman chooses not to testify, but other counselors do.
They were very solid on their suspect. They had no doubt. I mean, they had the firmness of their conviction that they had the right guy. And even when I went to Pryor, to the courthouse and testified, that they were confident that they had the right guy.
On March 19th, 1979, 22 months since Lori Farmer, Michelle Guzet, and Denise Milner were brutally murdered, the trial of the century in the state of Oklahoma begins.
The day of the trial that I was there, it was just chaotic. Cameras, reporters, it's just like all of these characters with this huge audience watching.
One side was, leave Jean Leroy Hart alone, he's been framed, and the other side was convinced that Jean Leroy Hart had committed this crime, had murdered these 3 babies. People have already formed those opinions. This was a powder keg in Mays County.
You think of like the O.J. Simpson trial or something, it had a little bit of that aspect. So it was really kind of a circus atmosphere. It was a big deal. Everything surrounding the trial was controversial. It was mostly a circumstantial case. One of the main things they tried to do was to link Hart to those items in that cave, because it would indicate that whoever had been in the cave had been involved in the crime. That was important to the prosecution because those were the things that would link him to the crime itself. It's very important to understand this trial was before DNA. DNA had not become a tool that could be used either to prove innocence or guilt at this time. It was pre-DNA.
The main thing they were looking for were hair and fiber and blood evidence.
So they did put on, as they called it, scientific evidence. There were hairs found on the duct tape that the girls had been bound up with that was what was described as Native American hair. They used that to try and implicate Hart because, of course, he was a Cherokee. But the idea that hair could be matched, even at the time, that was not good science to believe that hair could be matched.
Though DNA testing is not yet available, the prosecution also claims that sperm samples taken from Jean Hart's underwear are similar to the sperm found in one of the girls' sleeping bags.
There are a lot of questions surrounding the collection methods and the comparisons. And one of those questions is that Janice Davis, the forensic scientist for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, collected Jean Hart's underwear out of the jail months after he had been gone. And so, of course, it was decomposed. That's what sperm does over time.
Now, there are some interesting things about evidence that didn't get in that would tend to incriminate Hart, but were properly excluded by the judge. When Hart abducted and raped 2 women, he tied their hands together with a certain kind of unique knot, and the girls were tied with that same knot. The only way you could put that into evidence, you'd have to disclose to the jury that he had a prior criminal conviction, which would be improper if he didn't take the stand.
If a defendant takes a stand, that opens up the door for the prosecution to be able to get up and ask questions as well. And the defendant would have to be extremely careful about what they've said on the stand. But you don't want to bring up a criminal past. It will taint the jury's opinion of the defendant. So that's why they want to keep prior offenses out, so that jurors can deliberate and hear evidence just on the one offense they're being presented with at the moment.
After a week of testimony, the state rests its case and the defense takes over.
There was important evidence on the scene which tended to exonerate her. There was a bloody footprint on the floor of the tent, and it was not Hart's footprint. It was the wrong size.
The footprint was, I think, 9.5, and Hart's feet were 11.5. So you can't change your fingerprints or shrink your feet. So, you know, those are scientific pieces of evidence that fly in the face of the allegation.
There was a thumbprint found on the flashlight, and it was not Hart's. So there was exonerating evidence found there, as well as evidence that implicated him. There was things there that would lead you to believe that someone else either involved or did the crime.
One of the most controversial claims that the defense put forth in the trial was that some of the evidence had been planted by Sheriff Weaver.
Specifically, the photos of the women that had been taken by the photographer at Granite Prison. The deputy sheriff said that he had seen these in Weaver's office at a time before the murders were committed.
The evidence that did link him from the cave is questionable. I've interviewed a witness who says that he was a deputy sheriff at the time and that he saw those items in the sheriff's office after Gene Hart escaped. So the only way they could have been found in the cave is if somebody from the sheriff's office put them in the cave and allowed them to be found. So that's why I think that some of it was planted.
Hart's attorneys did not want to put him on the stand and give prosecutors a chance to cross-examine him. Well, how do you get someone's story out if you can't put them on the stand to tell their story? The next best thing is a press conference. And so that's what they did. And it gave Hart a chance to speak, to come across as sympathetic to the public, because this was such an explosive, divisive, horrible case. Public opinion was really going to matter.
My religion was twofold, in that I believe in the Bible, I believe in God, I believe there'll be a second coming of Christ, but I also believe in our ancient and traditional Cherokee religion. And in the end, I would guess that it would be my opinion that they both will eventually relate to the same one, because there's only one God.
Gene Leroy Hart came across really well. You know, he looked good. He was coherent. He didn't come across as the monster you would envision who would murder 3 little girls. For those on the side of the line who were sure that Mr. Hart had committed these crimes, this had to have really hurt. It had to have felt really disrespectful to them, because in their minds, he had killed their children.
The entire trial spans 11 emotional days. But the all-white jury spends just 5 hours deliberating before making their decision.
The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was shocked when the verdict was read, that their work was not sufficient enough to get him convicted. Pete Weaver, I thought he was damaged by not getting the conviction. He never really seemed to be the same after that case.
At least some of the jurors were extremely critical of the investigation. One juror made a comment to the extent that it was a screwed up mess, or words to that effect.
Jurors make it clear that the shoe size and thumbprint that do not match Gene Hart are major factors in their decision to acquit. They also point out that the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation lied on the stand about taking the photo of Hart at the time of his capture. Juror Leela Ramsey says it best in an interview with local television after the trial.
Larry Bowles was on the stand. He was talking to the jury, and Barbara and Isaac asked him, said, were any pictures taken the day over there when they arrested Gene Hart? And he said, no, not any. He said, you didn't take any pictures? And they said, no. We're sitting here looking at 8 to 10 glosses of that very man posed like he'd bagged a big game. He lied to us. I'm not saying he's not guilty. And I am saying that the evidence showed he was not one person done by themselves. We all 12 agreed on that. That there was enough evidence to show that it had been more than one person. There was a lot of manufactured evidence, a lot of sloppiness in the procedure.
If you think about just the logistics of trying to control 3 little girls, why one of them wouldn't have woken up and screamed or run or something that would have disclosed the presence of whoever the killer was, it's hard to see how one person could manage them all. Well, Gene Hart was returned to the penitentiary to serve the rest of his, what was 305 years of sentence for his previous crimes. He was only 35 years old.
Unshakably convinced Hart was the killer, the Oklahoma authorities hope he will confess in prison. But those hopes die on June 4th, 1979.
Within a couple of months, he had a heart attack and died.
With Hart's death, the case of the Girl Scout murders is classified as open but inactive. And that's how it has officially remained for 45 years.
I was born in Arkansas, but my entire life was spent in the Cherokee Nation in a little town called Proctor. So my sisters tell the story that I was 12 years old and I was perched on the edge of Mom and Dad's bed, just engrossed in this documentary about the Girl Scout murders.
27 girls had been assigned to Kiowa Unit.
And I don't understand why I was, but I wanted to learn everything there was to know about the Girl Scouts. Lori Farmer was an avid reader like I was, and the night before she died, she was reading Where the Red Fern Grows. And I identified with Michelle Gouzet because she had asked her parents to take care of her African violets before she left. She had an interest in protecting even plants. And so I just saw a piece of myself in each of those girls. And I think even at age 12, I was really drawn to the idea that there had to be some kind of a reckoning for what happened to them. What happened to them could not be allowed to stand. Even at age 12, I knew that. So I went to law school and I graduated. I became a corporate attorney, and then I was really miserable. 10 years ago, I left a successful career in the law to pursue my dream of becoming a full-time writer. I didn't have actual success until my 3rd book, which came out in 2017. And then I was working on my next novel in 2019 when the principal from Stowell High School came calling. So I got a job offer to teach creative writing at Stowell High School in the Cherokee Nation, where I graduated in the 90s. we have this concept, it's like a core tenet of the Cherokee Nation. It's called Gadoogie, and it means that you put the needs of your people ahead of the needs of your own. In the Cherokee Nation, we have a lot of great things, and then we also have some serious issues. And one of those issues is poverty. At Stoll High School, we're 85% Cherokee, and it's also 45% child poverty. I felt like I could probably have an impact on Cherokee kids, and that was really what motivated me. I started encouraging them to tell their own story and the story of their town. And I thought, hey, we can make a podcast together and be a part of retelling the story. So one group decided that they were going to study the Girl Scout murders.
It was kind of heartbreaking for these girls.
I'd like there to be a lot of answers to what happened and the right answers.
It doesn't feel real. Like, it's just crazy. It's really just crazy.
We wanted to know who wanted to do this to innocent children. It's been over 40 years since these horrific crimes, but many questions still remain unanswered. We wanted to speak with law enforcement about the crime scene and the investigation, but over 40 years later, many of the detectives and law enforcement have passed away.
The next day, and I told my students, you're not going to believe this. I think we got some new information. Okay, so something really crazy happened. I just got finished writing about it in my journal, but I feel like something really crazy is happening, and I want to make sure that I have a record of it. My students decided that they were going to research the Girl Scout murders for their podcast, and I posted about it, and I got this really kind of cryptic message that said, if you're looking into the Girl Scout murders, there's someone that you really need to meet. And so I was curious. But also a little freaked out. I'd been contacted about Paul Smith, who was the sheriff of Mays County in 1980. He was elected after Pete Weaver left office. He was 97 years old, living in a retirement home, and he had some story he wanted to talk to me about.
I wanted you to go, but I didn't want you to go alone, if that makes sense. You never know what could happen.
Although, in my defense, I have the body of an NFL linebacker, and this is a 97-year-old man in a nursing home. So I didn't. But yeah.
You may be crazy for saying that this guy got this information, but you're gonna be even more crazy if you don't go and look at it. Take a chance. Sometimes taking a risk can be the best thing that happens.
I knew he was about to drop some truth on me. I was not prepared, though, for what I heard. It was one of the most extraordinary stories I've ever heard, and still to this day, it still boggles my mind.
I know who did it.
everything surrounding the trial was controversial.
It was just chaotic.
Contentious may not be big enough of a word for what happened.
There was a lot of manufactured evidence, a lot of sloppiness in the whole procedure. There's not one person done by themselves. We all 12 agreed on that.
They acquitted him of it because the jury says you didn't do it.
But let's be real clear about Sheriff Pete Weaver. He was unqualified to investigate any kind of a murder, much less a complicated murder. They have never found the person who killed 3 young Girl Scouts. How many cases that are 50 years old that ever get solved?
2020, I became a teacher. I thought, hey, we can make a podcast together. One group decided that they were going to study the Girl Scout murders.
It's still like a cold case. Maybe there's something else that needs to be found here.
And I told my students, you're not going to believe this. I think we got some new information.
I know who did it.
In the spring of 2021, high school students in Faith Phillips' creative writing class launched a podcast called 40-Year-Old Justice.
We wanted to speak with law enforcement about the crime scene and the investigation, but over 40 years later, many of the detectives and law enforcement have passed away.
So I posted about it on my social media, and a couple days later, I got contacted by this mysterious person in my direct messages. And this person said, if your students are looking into the Girl Scout murders, there's someone you need to talk to. Paul Smith, who was the sheriff of Mays County in 1980. He was elected after Pete Weaver left office. He was 97 years old, living in a retirement home, and he had some story he wanted to talk to me about. It was in the middle of COVID, and I couldn't even get in to see my own grandmother. So I couldn't believe that I was going to get in to see this 97-year-old man in an assisted living center. But his caregivers arranged for me to get in to see him.
Paul Smith was a local cop in Locust Grove, Oklahoma at the time of the Girl Scout murders in 1977. In 1980, he won election as Mays County Sheriff, succeeding Pete Weaver, who had led the manhunt for Jean Leroy Hart. Smith promised to solve the case where Weaver had failed.
I entered this room. His war medals from World War II were hanging on the wall. It was apparent to me he considered himself a man of the law, and he was very proud of it.
Dear Heavenly Father, we appreciate the many blessings that you bestow upon us in our lives, Lord, and this is a special day, Lord, as we do this filming, and Paul gets to tell his story.
he struck me as a person who was a truth teller.
And I bug you to say your name and when you're a sheriff in Leeds County.
My name is Paul Smith. I was sheriff of Mays County from 1980 through 1980. '84. I had always wanted to be a police officer. When I was a kid, I just almost worshipped those guys when I saw them on the street in late '52 and early '53. I made application to the Tulsa Police Department, and they finally put me in the Vice Squad. That was the beginning of the end for me.
Paul had risen through the Tulsa police ranks, fulfilling his dream of becoming a detective. Ironically, his devotion to truth and justice would lead to his undoing.
I testified against a bunch of rotten policemen, several of the high-ranking people were taking payoffs. They indicted 19 people, the police commissioner, the chief of police, and some detectives, and prostitutes, gamblers. And I had a partner. After he testified in that grand jury, they transferred him to the dog pound. And then told me that I was going too. And I said, no, I'll give you my resignation. It ruined my career because I made more enemies among the police officers by telling the truth than I did friends. Left law enforcement for a while and then moved to Locust Grove. The chief of police is constantly after me. He'd go to work for him. So I did.
Paul reluctantly went back into law enforcement, and by the summer of 1977, was working as a Locust Grove city cop.
On June the 12th, 1977, I was sitting on a bench in front of the Wilson Cunningham Funeral Home, and as I sat there, I saw these big buses go through. I assumed carrying the little Girl Scouts. And following the bus was a Dodge Super Bee, a dark one. There may have been somebody in the back that I could not identify. I am not even sure. But the two in front, I recognized because I had had problems with them before. I had arrested that driver a number of times. the day they discovered the bodies, I was out of town all day. I remember.
Yeah, I'm gonna end it. I'm not gonna sit and watch this buffering bullshit. I'll play the rest of it later on. I don't know what's going on. Sorry, guys.
What happened after I got home.